It was the kind of neighborhood that looked like it had been pulled straight from a glossy magazine. Neat lawns, identical mailboxes, and a sign at the entrance that proudly read, "Welcome to Evergreen Estates, a community of excellence." The kind of place where everyone waved from their driveways, but secretly judged the length of your grass. Where every fence panel had to match, and no one dared paint their shutters without official permission. At first glance, Evergreen Estates was perfect. Too perfect. But beneath the clean sidewalks and trimmed hedges, there was a tension that every resident could feel. It started small. Notes about trash cans being left out too long, reminders about community harmony, and passive-aggressive emails about decorative consistency. And at the center of it all was Linda Matthews, the HOA president. Linda wasn't just the president. She was the HOA. Her word carried more weight than the bylaws themselves. She treated Evergreen Estates like her personal kingdom, patrolling the streets with a clipboard and camera phone, ready to record any infraction. People whispered that she'd once fined a family because their Halloween pumpkin had deteriorated in a way that invited pests. For years, residents had learned to keep their heads down. They followed every rule, every guideline, every demand, because crossing Linda meant trouble, letters, fines, and in some cases even threats of legal action. But this year, something different was brewing. December had arrived, and with it, the first signs of Christmas. A few wreaths appeared on doors, some subtle strings of lights flickered along gutters. It was the one time of year when Evergreen Estates didn't feel so sterile. The neighborhood glowed with warmth, color, and community, until Linda decided she didn't like that either. One cold morning, a message appeared in every resident's mailbox. It was printed on official HOA letterhead, bold and severe. Effective immediately, all outdoor Christmas decorations are suspended until further notice. Non-compliance will result in fines and disciplinary measures. The reason? Visual clutter. The community was stunned. Some shrugged and took their decorations down. Others grumbled but complied. But there was one homeowner who didn't. At the end of Cedar Lane stood a modest two-story house owned by Mark Benson, a quiet man who'd lived there for 6 years. He wasn't one for drama, but he loved Christmas. Every December he'd turn his yard into a cheerful, glowing display, nothing crazy, just enough to make passing cars slow down and smile. That year, Mark had already begun unpacking his lights when the HOA notice arrived. He stood in his driveway reading it under the weak winter sun, feeling a slow burn of disbelief turn into something sharper. He'd followed every rule for years, kept his lawn trimmed, his siding clean, his mailbox polished. But this was too much. As night fell, the neighborhood looked darker than usual. Where there should have been twinkling colors, there was only silence and shadow. But in the quiet, an idea began to take shape in Mark's mind. If Linda wanted to ban Christmas, he'd give her something to ban. In the days that followed, he started planning. He took careful notes, drew sketches, checked power limits. He spent hours online researching synchronized light systems and wireless controllers. He wasn't just going to decorate, he was going to make a statement. And while he worked in secret, Evergreen Estates carried on as usual. Linda drove by daily, ensuring compliance. Every porch was bare, every lawn silent. She felt satisfied. She'd restored order, she thought. But behind Mark's closed garage door, the hum of activity grew louder. Boxes of lights, projectors, inflatables, and speakers began to fill the space. He wired circuits, tested patterns, and mapped every inch of his property. His plan wasn't just to decorate. It was to transform his home into the most dazzling light show Evergreen Estates had ever seen. The first test came late one night. A faint shimmer of red and green lights flickered across the side of his house. Mark adjusted dials, tightened connections, and smiled. It worked. Over the next week, he kept working, always after dark, always quietly. From the street, his house looked ordinary. But inside, it was a workshop of controlled chaos. Extension cords snaking across the floor, tangled strings of LEDs, and a laptop filled with sequencing software. By the time December 15th arrived, everything was ready. The neighborhood still lay in darkness, subdued and joyless. The air was cold and still. Then, one evening just after sunset, the silence broke. A faint jingle echoed through the air, followed by a burst of light so bright it could be seen from 3 streets away. Mark's house came alive. synchronized lights dancing perfectly to music that could be heard all the way to the neighborhood entrance. Santa waved from the roof. Reindeer galloped across the lawn. Snowflakes swirled up the walls in dazzling patterns. Cars began to slow down. People rolled down their windows, smiling, laughing, filming. Within an hour, traffic formed along Cedar Lane. Neighbors who had taken down their own decorations came out to watch, clapping and cheering. And somewhere, just a few houses away, Linda Matthews stood frozen on her porch, staring in disbelief at the spectacle blazing across the street. Her perfect neighborhood was glowing, without her permission. She didn't know it yet, but Evergreen Estates was about to become famous. Because that night, as the lights pulsed in time to Jingle Bell Rock, one of the spectators uploaded a video to social media. Within hours, it was everywhere. Mark's house had gone viral, and Linda's war on Christmas had just begun. By the next morning, Evergreen Estates was buzzing. Cars still lined Cedar Lane, even after the music had gone quiet. Tire tracks etched into the frost-bitten grass. Candy wrappers fluttered in the wind, and the faint echo of Christmas music still lingered in the air. Everyone was talking about the show. Some called it beautiful, others called it insane, but one thing was certain. No one had ever seen anything like it. Mark's light show had done what no HOA meeting ever could. It united the neighborhood. Families came together on the sidewalks. Children laughed. Strangers waved. For a moment, Evergreen Estates wasn't a strict community bound by rules. It was alive. But not everyone was smiling. At 8 a.m. sharp, Linda Matthews arrived at the HOA office, a converted spare room in her own home, carrying a thick folder labeled Cedar Lane Violation. Her jaw was tight, her expression set. The viral video had already reached her inbox. Not because she watched social media, but because several concerned residents had forwarded it to her with subject lines like, "You should see this." Linda didn't need to see it. She could already picture it perfectly. The flashing lights, the music, the cars. To her, it wasn't festive. It was chaos, disorder, a violation of everything Evergreen Estates stood for. By noon, an official HOA letter had been drafted, printed, and hand-delivered to Mark Benson's front door. It was firm, detailed, and dripping with authority. It cited Section 5, Paragraph 12 of the HOA Code. All outdoor displays, decorations, or lighted exhibits must be pre-approved by the association to ensure visual harmony. It warned that his current, unauthorized display was in direct violation of HOA standards. The fine, $250 per day of non-compliance. Mark found the letter that afternoon, folded neatly in an envelope with the HOA seal. He read it slowly, standing at his mailbox as the wind rustled the paper. The words were sharp, deliberate, designed to intimidate. But he didn't flinch. He knew what Linda was trying to do, scare him into silence. But this wasn't about lights anymore. It was about principle. That night, he turned the show back on. And this time, it was even brighter. He'd added more sequences, more color. The lights now pulsed in perfect rhythm with Carol of the Bells. The trees shimmered, the snow glowed, and the garage door projected a countdown timer to Christmas Day. People cheered. Cars honked. And Linda, standing at the end of her driveway, could only stare in disbelief as her warnings were ignored. The next morning, another letter arrived. Then another, each one angrier than the last. The fines doubled, then tripled. She accused Mark of violating noise ordinances, obstructing traffic, and even causing emotional distress to nearby residents. But the truth was, most of those residents were outside every night, laughing and recording videos. Even local news outlets began to notice. A crew showed up one evening, filming the show for a holiday spirit segment. By the weekend, Evergreen Estates had become a destination. Cars poured in from neighboring towns. People parked along side streets, bundled in coats and scarves, sipping hot chocolate while the lights danced. The HOA Facebook page, once filled with reminders about lawn maintenance and meeting schedules, exploded with comments. Some praised Mark for bringing joy back to the neighborhood. Others warned about the chaos, the noise, the traffic. But one thing was clear. Everyone was watching. Linda tried to fight back. She called emergency board meetings, sent cease and desist letters, even contacted the city about public nuisance violations. But each attempt backfired. The city told her they had no jurisdiction over holiday lights unless there was a safety hazard. To make things worse, a local radio station caught wind of the story and interviewed Mark live on air. He was calm, polite, and firm, explaining that his display wasn't just for fun, but for charity. Donations collected from visitors were being sent to the local children's hospital. That revelation changed everything. Suddenly, Mark wasn't just the guy with the crazy light show. He was a hero, a man standing up against an overbearing HOA for a good cause. Donations poured in online. People started calling the display the miracle on Cedar Lane. Linda was furious. Her inbox overflowed with angry messages accusing her of being the Grinch. Neighbors avoided her on walks. Even some members of the HOA board began to question her leadership. She doubled down. Late one night, while the display was running, she walked the perimeter of Mark's property, clipboard in hand, snapping photos. She measured distances, noted wiring routes, and jotted down potential fire hazards. In her mind, if she couldn't stop him through fines, she'd find another way. Mark, meanwhile, stayed one step ahead. He made sure every connection was safe, every wire secured, every code followed to the letter. He'd done his research. The show continued, night after night. Cars filled the streets. Laughter echoed. The air smelled of cocoa and pine. And in the middle of it all, Linda stood isolated, watching her power slip away. By December 22nd, she had filed an official complaint with the HOA's Regional Association, demanding immediate enforcement. But bureaucracy moved slowly, and Christmas was only days away. The night before Christmas Eve, she made one final move. As the lights danced and crowds gathered, Linda appeared with a flashlight and a rolled-up document. Witnesses later said she looked determined, almost unhinged. She marched straight to Mark's yard and taped a large red notice to his mailbox. Final warning, immediate removal required. The crowd went silent as she walked away, her heels clicking against the pavement. The lights kept flashing, the music kept playing, and for a brief moment, Linda thought she had won. But she didn't know what Mark had planned next. Because while she was busy trying to shut him down, Mark had prepared something special, something that would play exactly at midnight on Christmas Eve. And when it happened, Evergreen Estates would never be the same again. Christmas Eve arrived like the calm before a storm. Evergreen Estates, once a quiet suburban enclave, now felt like the epicenter of a small festive revolution. From dawn to dusk, cars trickled in from every direction. Local news vans parked along the main road. Reporters interviewed smiling families who called it the best Christmas display in the state. The HOA's once impeccable streets were crowded with visitors holding cocoa cups and phones, eager to witness what everyone was calling the Cedar Lane spectacle. But not everyone shared the excitement. Inside her pristine home at the corner of Maple and Cedar, Linda Matthews sat at her kitchen table, staring at a pile of papers that represented everything she stood for: violation reports, letters, ordinances, and bylaws. But none of it seemed to matter anymore. The community she had once controlled had turned against her. The board members who used to echo her authority now avoided her calls. Even her husband had stopped attending HOA meetings, embarrassed by the mounting backlash. On the counter beside her phone lay the bright red notice she had taped to Mark's mailbox the night before. The ink had bled slightly from the frost, but the message was still clear. Final warning. She had tried everything: letters, fines, threats, but the lights still blazed every night. Each flicker, each musical beat felt like an open act of defiance, a challenge she couldn't ignore. And tonight, Christmas Eve, was the final insult. By 6 p.m., the crowd outside had doubled. Cars stretched all the way to the neighborhood entrance, headlights glowing like a slow-moving river of anticipation. The hum of conversation, laughter, and holiday music filled the air. Mark's house stood at the center of it all, completely still, dark and silent, waiting. People whispered that he had promised something special, a finale unlike anything before. Social media was already buzzing. Live streams had begun. Local stations teased a Christmas Eve light show that's breaking all the rules. As the clock neared midnight, the temperature dropped. Frost coated the lawns and the air turned crisp and still. Even the crowd grew quieter, sensing something was about to happen. And then, at exactly 12 a.m., the lights came alive. The house erupted in a breathtaking cascade of color, reds, greens, blues, golds, rippling in perfect synchronization. Every window, every shingle, every tree burst into movement. Music swelled, beginning softly with Silent Night, then building into a grand orchestral medley. But this time, there was something new. Projected across the side of the house was a massive digital display, a message glowing in white light. Merry Christmas, Evergreen Estates. This show is dedicated to the children at St. Mary's Hospital. Thank you for helping raise $82,000 in donations. The crowd gasped. Applause erupted. Children cheered. Strangers hugged. It wasn't just a show anymore. It was a moment of community, joy, and defiance, all rolled into one brilliant, glowing spectacle. And then came the finale. The lights dimmed to a soft golden hue, and a projection began to play across the roof, a slow-motion snowfall, shimmering and endless. Above it, in delicate white letters, appeared a final message. Christmas isn't about rules. It's about light. The crowd fell silent. Phones lifted. Tears glimmered in the cold air. Even those who had once doubted Mark stood in awe, caught up in the beauty of it all. But not Linda. She stood at the edge of her driveway, face pale, eyes wide, trembling with fury. Every flash of light felt like a personal insult. Every cheer sounded like laughter aimed at her authority. In that moment, something inside her snapped. Without warning, she marched down the street, past the onlookers and parked cars, her shoes crunching on the icy pavement. People turned to watch as she stormed toward the glowing house. The music played on, unaware of the approaching chaos. She reached the edge of Mark's yard, clutching a thick folder of documents, her last weapon. She waved it in the air, shouting over the music that no one could hear. Her words were lost in the rhythm and joy of the show. A cameraman nearby zoomed in, recognizing her instantly, the infamous HOA president, storming through a sea of holiday lights. The scene was surreal, almost cinematic. Linda reached the power box at the side of the lawn. Her hand hovered over the main switch. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. But before she could act, a voice from the crowd shouted something that made her pause. Cameras flashed. Phones recorded. The reality of 100 eyes watching her sank in. She froze. Then slowly she lowered her hand and turned back toward the street. The crowd's murmurs grew louder. The music continued, building toward its final crescendo, drums pounding, lights swirling in gold and white until the entire neighborhood glowed like a dream. When the final note faded, the crowd erupted into applause. The night sky filled with cheers, honking horns, and the faint sound of laughter echoing down Cedar Lane. Mark stepped outside, waving to the onlookers, smiling humbly as people thanked him, congratulated him, and donated more to the hospital fund. And Linda, silent, defeated, walked back toward her house under the cold starlight. The once proud ruler of Evergreen Estates now looked like just another neighbor, lost in the glow of something far greater than control. That night, as the neighborhood finally grew quiet, she sat in her living room surrounded by the dim reflection of Mark's lights flickering through her curtains. Her phone buzzed with notifications, videos, news articles, interview requests. The story had spread everywhere. Local HOA tries to ban Christmas, community fights back with dazzling charity light show. By morning, Evergreen Estates would be famous for all the wrong reasons. Linda's inbox filled with resignation emails from board members. Her voicemail overflowed, and in the middle of it all, one message stood out. An email from the regional HOA office requesting an urgent review of her conduct. Outside, the sun rose over the quiet street, glinting off the snow. The decorations were still up, the lights still twinkling faintly, even in daylight. Evergreen Estates, the community of order and uniformity, had become something it had never been before, a place of laughter, generosity, and color. And while most of the neighborhood prepared for a peaceful Christmas morning, Linda sat alone, staring out the window at the house across the street, the one she couldn't control, the one that had changed everything. What she didn't know was that the aftermath of that night was only beginning, because with fame came attention, and with attention came consequences, some good, some not. The neighborhood would soon face new problems, new challenges and new power struggles. But for now, Evergreen Estates slept under a soft blanket of snow, the echoes of music still hanging in the cold air, a silent reminder that sometimes the brightest lights come from the people willing to stand up and shine. By Christmas morning, Evergreen Estates had become a tourist attraction. The streets that once echoed with silence now hummed with the sound of engines, laughter, and holiday music. Strangers walked their dogs past homes they didn't own. Children posed for photos in front of Mark's glowing display. Even the local bakery down the road started selling Cedar Lane cocoa as a novelty drink. The video of the Christmas Eve showdown had spread like wildfire. Clips of Linda storming through the lights played on morning news programs, sandwiched between cheerful holiday stories. The headlines were merciless. HOA President versus Christmas. Grinch of Evergreen Estates. Light show that broke the rules, and the internet. For most of the neighborhood, it was hilarious. For Linda Matthews, it was humiliating. She hadn't left her house all morning. Curtains drawn, phone buzzing relentlessly, inbox overflowing. Reporters camped near her driveway, hoping for a comment. Her name was trending locally on social media. Someone had even made a meme of her face next to the Grinch, holding a clipboard. It was supposed to be a quiet, orderly community. Now, it was a circus. At 10 a.m., her phone rang again. The number on the screen made her stomach tighten. It was the regional HOA council. She hesitated before answering. The conversation was brief, polite, and devastating. An investigation had been launched into her handling of community affairs, effective immediately. Her position as HOA president was suspended pending review. The board would meet after the holidays to determine permanent action. The line went dead. Linda sat frozen at her kitchen table, staring at the blinking call log. For years, she had ruled this neighborhood with precision. She'd memorized every regulation, enforced every rule. And now, in 1 week, it was all slipping away. Outside, she could hear faint cheers as visitors arrived again to see the lights. The sound made her chest tighten with anger and shame. Across the street, Mark's house looked like a winter fairy tale. Even in daylight, it shimmered with color. A donation box sat near the sidewalk, already half full. A local reporter stood beside it, smiling into a camera, praising the heartwarming story of one man who stood up for the holiday spirit. Linda closed her blinds, but the world didn't close with them. By the day after Christmas, the neighborhood was overwhelmed. Cars clogged the cul-de-sacs, blocking driveways. Litter piled up near sidewalks. Residents who had once supported the show began to grow frustrated. Delivery trucks couldn't get through. Trash pickup was delayed. The very freedom that Mark's lights had inspired was now becoming a problem. Mark noticed it too. He spent his evenings directing traffic, helping cars turn around, cleaning the sidewalks after crowds dispersed. He meant well, but no matter what he did, it wasn't enough. The display had taken on a life of its own. And somewhere in that growing chaos, Linda found her opening. She began collecting photos again. Cars parked illegally, garbage overflow, noise complaints. This time her notes weren't emotional. They were calculated. She knew the community was starting to feel the strain, and she planned to use it. Within a week, she quietly began circulating a new petition for the restoration of order in Evergreen Estates. She framed it as a simple call for balance. No personal attacks, no mention of Mark by name. But everyone knew what it meant. Surprisingly, people started signing. Not because they disliked Mark, but because they wanted their peaceful neighborhood back. Parents who couldn't get their kids to sleep because of the crowds. Seniors who felt unsafe with strangers constantly driving through. Delivery drivers who stopped coming altogether. By New Year's Eve, the petition had enough signatures to call an emergency HOA meeting. Mark didn't find out until the notice appeared on his door. He read it slowly, feeling a strange mix of pride and dread. His house had become a symbol of joy, defiance, and now division. He'd won the battle for Christmas, but in the process, he'd started something he couldn't quite control. The meeting was scheduled for January 3rd. That night, for the first time in weeks, Mark turned off the lights early. The neighborhood fell into an uneasy darkness. People noticed immediately. Some thought the show had ended for good. Others feared the HOA had finally forced his hand. But inside his quiet home, Mark sat by the window, looking out at the dark yard that had once glowed so brightly. The silence felt heavy, almost sacred. He hadn't wanted this to turn into a war. He'd only wanted to celebrate Christmas and maybe remind people that joy shouldn't need permission. Across the street, Linda watched from her own window, the faint reflection of her face mirrored in the glass. For the first time in weeks, her street looked normal again, orderly, controlled. But she knew it wasn't over. The upcoming HOA meeting wasn't just about rules. It was about control, reputation, and power. And this time, both she and Mark had something to lose. In the days leading up to the meeting, rumors spread like wildfire. Some said the board planned to remove Linda permanently. Others claimed the community might vote to dissolve the HOA altogether. A few whispered that Mark was planning something for the meeting, something big. The tension grew thicker with each passing day. By the time January 3rd arrived, Evergreen Estates was divided. Half the neighborhood wanted freedom from rules. The other half wanted their quiet lives back. The meeting would decide which side won. That evening, as residents filed into the small clubhouse at the entrance of the subdivision, the air buzzed with anticipation. The tables were stacked with documents, microphones, and nameplates. Cameras flashed as reporters filed in, ready to capture what had become the most talked-about HOA meeting in the county. Linda arrived first, dressed sharply, her posture stiff but composed. The weeks of ridicule had left her bruised but not broken. She was ready to reclaim what she had lost. Mark arrived next, calm and polite, carrying a binder filled with permits, safety reports, and donation records. His show might have broken the rules, but he was prepared to prove it had done more good than harm. When the meeting began, the crowd fell silent. For the first time in months, the people of Evergreen Estates sat together, not as enemies, but as witnesses to a fight that had come to define their community. And as the gavel struck to call the session to order, both Linda and Mark knew, whatever happened next, Evergreen Estates would never be the same again. The air inside the Evergreen Estates clubhouse was thick with tension. Outside, the night had fallen cold and quiet, but within those four walls, the neighborhood's simmering drama was about to reach its boiling point. Rows of folding chairs filled the small meeting space, every seat occupied. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in months sat side by side, their faces tight with anticipation. A few whispered among themselves, glancing nervously toward the front of the room where a long folding table had been set up for the HOA board. Cameras from 2 local news stations were stationed at the back, lenses pointed toward the podium. The viral Christmas light show had made Evergreen Estates a household name, and now everyone wanted to see how the story would end. At exactly 7 o'clock, the meeting was called to order. The board members took their seats, some stern, some visibly uneasy. At the center sat the acting chairperson filling in for Linda during her suspension. But Linda herself was there, sitting directly behind the board with her arms crossed, a folder of documents resting in her lap. Her face was composed, but her eyes betrayed her nerves. The week since Christmas had stripped her authority bare. She had lost her title, her allies, and her control. But she wasn't done yet. Across the room, Mark sat quietly near the front row. He had arrived early, shaking hands, greeting people politely, thanking them for their support. He wasn't dressed like a fighter. He was dressed like a neighbor, simple, steady, and calm. The chairperson cleared his throat and began reading the agenda. Item 1, Community Response to the Unauthorized Holiday Display on Cedar Lane. The murmurs began instantly. Some residents leaned forward, eager. Others crossed their arms defensively. Mark listened silently as the board read through the complaints. Traffic congestion, noise violations, obstructed streets. Each item was delivered like ammunition, one after another. The list sounded damning, until the second half of the report began. For every complaint, there was a counterpoint. Letters from residents thanking Mark for the joy he brought. Testimonies from visitors who donated to the hospital. Statements from city inspectors confirming his display met every safety code. The board members shifted uncomfortably. The balance of the room began to tilt. Then came the financial report. $82,000 raised for St. Mary's Children's Hospital, plus an additional $10,000 donated after the viral video aired. A quiet murmur swept through the room. Even those who had grown tired of the crowds couldn't ignore the good that had come from it. Mark stood when his name was called. He spoke calmly, his tone respectful but firm. He acknowledged the disruptions, apologized for any inconvenience, and thanked his neighbors for their patience. Then he explained what had motivated him, not rebellion, but tradition. He spoke about growing up in a small town where Christmas lights were a symbol of togetherness, about moving to Evergreen Estates and loving its beauty, but feeling, over time, that it had lost its warmth. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. His words filled the room with quiet reflection. By the time he finished, even the board members looked softened, but Linda Matthews was not moved. When the floor opened for comments, she rose from her seat like a shadow reclaiming form. The room fell silent. She walked to the podium, heels clicking, posture perfect. She opened her folder and began reading in her sharp, practiced tone. She listed violations, fines, bylaws, and responsibilities. She spoke of order, structure, and the purpose of community governance. But as she went on, something strange happened. The room began to turn. Not loudly, not visibly, just a slow collective shift. Neighbors looked away, bored or weary. They'd heard all this before. The language of control, the sound of authority for authority's sake. Her voice grew tighter, more desperate. She started speaking faster, trying to regain the energy, but it was gone. Her power, once absolute, now echoed hollow against the walls. When she finished, there was a pause. Then a quiet voice from the back of the room spoke. A man named David, who'd lived in Evergreen Estates for over 20 years. He said he respected Linda's dedication, but that somewhere along the way, the HOA had stopped protecting the community and started suffocating it. A few people nodded. Then another voice, a young mother, spoke up about how the light show had been the first time her kids had seen neighbors laughing together in years. Someone else mentioned how they'd met new friends during the event. The stories began to spill out like water from a cracked dam. One after another, residents spoke, not about rules, but about life, about how it felt to finally see color in their neighborhood again, about how joy didn't have to come at the cost of peace. Linda sat frozen, her hands tightening around her folder. The control she'd spent years building was evaporating in real time. When the comments ended, the acting chairperson thanked everyone and announced the board's decision. Effective immediately, the suspension of Linda Matthews would become permanent. She was officially removed from her position as HOA president. A collective exhale filled the room. Some clapped quietly, others sat in stunned silence. Then, the chairperson turned to the second motion, one proposed by multiple residents. A vote to amend the HOA bylaws to allow seasonal decorative displays within reasonable limits, provided they do not pose a safety hazard. The motion passed almost unanimously. For the first time in its history, Evergreen Estates had voted to loosen its own rules. As the meeting adjourned, people lingered in the aisles, chatting and smiling, the weight of months of tension finally lifting. Mark stood near the door, shaking hands and thanking everyone. Linda remained seated, staring at the empty table where her authority had once rested. No one approached her. No one spoke. She gathered her folder slowly, her movements precise but hollow. When she finally stood and walked out into the cold night, the crowd parted silently. The air outside was crisp and quiet. Across the street, faint remnants of holiday lights still glimmered on rooftops, reflecting off the frost. Evergreen Estates, once a monument to order, now felt alive again. Linda paused for a moment at the edge of the parking lot. She looked back at the clubhouse, the place where she had ruled, where she had fallen, and for a brief second, her expression softened. Then she turned and walked into the darkness. Mark watched her go from across the street. He didn't feel triumph, only closure, because in the end, it wasn't about winning or losing. It was about restoring balance to a place that had forgotten what community meant. And though the holiday season was over, its light, his light, had changed everything. But the story of Evergreen Estates wasn't finished yet. Because when fame fades and peace returns, old patterns have a way of resurfacing. And sometimes, the hardest part of rebuilding a community isn't defeating the rules. It's learning to live without them. Winter lingered over Evergreen Estates like a quiet afterthought. The snow that had fallen on Christmas week was now thinning, melting into the edges of the sidewalks. The air was still sharp, but the frenzy had faded. The cameras were gone. The reporters had moved on to new stories, and for the first time in months, the neighborhood was calm. But it wasn't the same Evergreen Estates it had been before. Something had shifted, something subtle, but permanent. The once silent streets now felt alive in small, meaningful ways. Children played in driveways again. Neighbors waved to one another without suspicion. A few houses even kept small strands of lights glowing through January, not in rebellion, but as a quiet tribute to what they'd rediscovered. The Great Christmas Light War, as the internet had dubbed it, was over, but its echoes still danced in every window that dared to shine. Mark Benson had become something of a local legend. People recognized him at the grocery store, at the gas station, even at church. They thanked him for standing up, for reminding them that rules should serve people, not the other way around. He took the attention humbly. He never bragged, never gloated. In interviews, he always said the same thing, that the lights were never meant to start a fight, only to celebrate Christmas. By mid-January, his yard was finally bare again. The inflatables were packed away, the wires coiled, the sequencers stored neatly in the garage. The house looked plain now, ordinary, quiet. But in the stillness, he felt content. One cold morning, while taking his trash bin to the curb, Mark noticed a small envelope tucked under the handle. His name was written in looping cursive. He opened it slowly. Inside was a handwritten note. "I suppose I forgot what this season was about. Thank you for reminding me. Linda." There was no return address, no signature beyond her first name, just a note, simple, human, and sincere. Mark folded it carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He didn't tell anyone about it. Some things, he thought, didn't need to be shared. Across the street, Linda Matthews had changed too. She no longer held any title, no authority. The HOA had quietly appointed a new president, a younger, friendlier woman named Alicia, who promised to bring balance and cooperation back to the neighborhood. Linda kept to herself at first. She stopped patrolling, stopped writing notes, but every so often she was seen outside, tending to her garden, chatting politely with neighbors she'd once scolded. Slowly the walls she'd built began to crumble. It was strange for her, learning to live in the community she used to control. She didn't always like it, but she was learning to listen. One evening, as February approached, Mark was in his garage cleaning when he saw movement across the street. Linda was standing at the edge of her yard, stringing a short strand of white lights around her mailbox. Just a few bulbs, nothing fancy. For a moment, she hesitated, glancing toward his house. Mark simply smiled and gave a small nod. She nodded back, quietly, and continued wrapping the lights. When they flickered on, the glow was soft, almost shy, but it was there. In that gentle light, something unspoken passed between them. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. The following months brought a new kind of peace. The HOA, under Sufi, new leadership rewrote its bylaws, not to remove structure, but to make it humane. Decorative freedom within reason. Penalties replaced with warnings. Meetings that focused on community events instead of enforcement. For the first time in years, Evergreen Estates began to feel like what it had always claimed to be, a community. By spring, lawns flourished, porches filled with planters, and children's chalk drawings colored the sidewalks. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive. And though the world outside moved on, the legend of the Christmas light show that defied the HOA lived online. Every December, the videos resurfaced, people rediscovering the story of the quiet man who stood up for Christmas spirit and accidentally changed an entire neighborhood. Mark never recreated the massive display again, not like that first year. But every December, he still put up lights, simple ones, a glowing wreath, a few strings across the roofline, and a small sign near the sidewalk that read, "Joy is meant to be shared." Neighbors began adding their own touches, lights, ornaments, snowmen, reindeer. Even Linda, by the second Christmas after the Showdown, had a tree in her front window, visible from the street, its lights twinkling softly through the glass. Evergreen Estates had become something new, not a place of strict perfection, but one of quiet pride. The HOA still existed, but now it served instead of ruled. Meetings included potlucks, and instead of fines, there were friendly reminders. The fear that once hung over the community had been replaced by laughter and a sense of belonging. And, yet sometimes late at night when the snow fell and the streetlights flickered, Mark would stand at his window and remember that first show. The hum of the lights, the cheers of the crowd, the sound of music echoing through the cold air. It had started as defiance, but it had ended as something far greater. Because the truth was, the Christmas light war was never really about decorations. It was about power and pride and the simple human need to feel free. In trying to ruin his Christmas, the HOA had ended up reigniting something that had been lost long before, the spirit of community. And that, Mark thought, as he watched the gentle lights blink across the street, was the real miracle on Cedar Lane.